Think about a moment when you received, a little more money than you expected.
Like a raise or maybe a year-end bonus.
Yeah, exactly. Or just a certain windfall. And notice the brief, quiet exhale of relief.
That subtle dropping of your shoulders.
Right. Notice how the mental math you're always doing in the background of your life suddenly just pauses.
It's a nice feeling.
It is. And then, well, notice how quickly that relief vanishes.
Oh, yeah. It gets replaced by a new baseline of normal incredibly fast.
It really does. And I want to be very clear with you, listening right up front. The mission of this deep dive isn't to judge your spending habits.
No, not at all.
We aren't here to offer some sort of financial seminar or point out where you're failing at budgeting. Instead, this is a calm observational journey into the human mind.
We're gently exploring the hidden systems, right? The deeply ingrained habits, the emotional triggers.
Yeah, and the incredibly subtle shifts in our expectations that dictate why earning more money, rarely, if ever, makes us feel richer.
Because that feeling of sudden abundance is, well, it's incredibly fragile. The relief almost never survives the transition into routine.
Right, and it forces us to look at the architecture of our own behavior.
Yeah.
Because we spend an enormous amount of our life energy acquiring resources.
Yeah, operating under this unexamined assumption that the acquisition itself is the finish line.
But we rarely stop to observe what actually happens inside our heads the moment those resources arrive.
Yeah.
So to understand this, we have to isolate that exact moment.
The second the new money hits the account.
Exactly. Because an entirely predictable psychological sequence begins. And I'm looking at the concept of lifestyle creep here, or lifestyle inflation.
Right, which is essentially the tendency for our fixed and discretionary spending to rise in exact lockstep with our income.
Yeah. But what's fascinating is how this manifests in a very specific modern demographic, the hen rise.
Ah, yes. High earners, not rich yet.
It's such a great acronym.
It really is, and the dissonance of that demographic is striking. I mean, these are individuals, often highly educated, making significant salaries well into the multiple six figures.
So by any objective historical standard, they exist in the top percentiles of earners.
Right. Yet subjectively, their lived experience is often one of, profound financial precarity.
They're frequently living paycheck to paycheck.
Exactly. Carrying consumer debt, feeling completely trapped. The absolute wealth they accumulate is vastly disproportionate to their sheer earning power.
Because earning doesn't actually make you feel rich. Spending does.
That's the trap.
Right. If I take a massive paycheck and immediately deploy 99% of it into the economy, buying the clothes, swiping the card for the dinners, leasing the car, I get a momentary neurological rush.
In that 5-second window at the restaurant terminal, you feel wealthy.
Yeah. But because I retain nothing, I'm permanently stuck in an accumulation loop.
The wealth is consumed rather than retained, and the psychological mechanisms driving that immediate consumption are deeply rooted.
It starts with mental accounting, right?
Yeah, mental accounting. It's a framework where we categorize funds differently based on their source. So when a raise or a bonus arrives, the mind naturally frames that specific pool of capital as a reward.
The internal narrative shifts from, this is my baseline survival resource, to I worked late for 6 months for this. I deserve to recognize that effort.
Which feels completely benign. Acknowledging hard work with a reward is how we motivate ourselves.
But that benign impulse collides with what behavioral economists call present bias.
Right, going back to the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky.
Yeah, they mapped out this concept of hyperbolic discounting.
We systematically overweight immediate rewards and heavily discount future ones.
And the skew is far more extreme than most people realize, isn't it?
Oh, it's massive. If given the choice between receiving $100 today or $110 next month, a massive percentage of the population will take the $100 today.
Even though the math on that is staggering. Earning $10 on a $100 principal in 30 days is essentially a 120% annualized return.
Right, a hedge fund manager would sell their soul for that kind of guaranteed yield.
But our brains simply discard it because the 30-day wait feels cognitively intolerable.
We are fighting our evolutionary hardware. The cognitive effort required to delay gratification and imagine a future self benefiting from that delayed resource is immensely high.
Because for a hunter-gatherer, delaying the consumption of calories was a massive, potentially fatal risk.
Exactly. The cognitively effortless default is immediate consumption. Saving isn't a passive state. It requires an active, deliberate, and sustained counter-decision against our own biology.
So let's track how this plays out in a modern environment. The raise hits, The mental accounting labels it a reward. Present bias demands immediate deployment.
Right.
And then we hit this terrifying transformation where a luxury quietly, almost invisibly, morphs into a necessity.
It happens so fast.
It does. If I was perfectly content with my standard gym membership before the raise, I might upgrade to a boutique wellness club as my reward.
Sure.
But within 3 months, that boutique club isn't a reward anymore. It's just where I work out. The standard gym now feels unacceptable.
Almost unsanitary.
Right.
This is the ratchet effect in consumption. A physical ratchet is a mechanical gear that allows continuous motion in one direction, but physically blocks motion in the reverse direction.
It only clicks upward.
Exactly. And in behavioral economics, spending ratchets up with absolute fluidity. The friction is zero. But ratcheting down is not just mathematically difficult, it is psychologically excruciating.
It's the pain of perceived deprivation.
Mm.
And I want to walk through the specific mathematical scenario provided in the research because seeing the numbers strips away the abstract theory.
Let's do it.
So we have a worker, let's call him Alex. He receives an $18,000 annual raise.
Okay.
On a $90,000 salary, that's a 20% bump. It's a phenomenal career milestone.
That kind of increase alters the trajectory of a career.
But let's look at the monthly reality. After taxes, that $18,000 might net out to roughly $1,080 a month in usable liquidity.
So Alex feels flush.
Right. He feels great. So year one of the new era, he makes a few localized upgrades. He moves to an apartment with a slightly better view and in-unit laundry.
Okay, let's say that's $450 more a month.
He turns in his old car and leases a nicer model.
An extra $180 a month.
He joins that boutique wellness club we mentioned.
$120.
He starts dining out at the places his higher-earning colleagues frequent.
Let's add another $200 a month for that.
And he throws in a few premium streaming and delivery subscriptions.
$60 right there.
So the sum of those micro decisions is brutal when you actually add it up.
Let's see, 450 plus 180 plus 120 plus 200 plus 60. That is a monthly spending increase of exactly $1,010.
Out of $1,080 of net new income.
Yeah.
He got an $18,000 raise, and he is retaining $70 a month, $840 a year.
It feels like filling a glass with water, but every time you pour more in, the glass itself expands.
You're never actually full. The water level never actually rose.
And the lack of retained capital is only the surface problem here. The deeper issue is the introduction of profound financial fragility.
How so?
Well, Alex has permanently elevated his spending floor. His baseline structural cost of existing has skyrocketed.
Oh, I see.
So if the economy turns or his firm downsizes or he simply burns out and wants to take a lower stress job for less money, he is trapped.
Because the apartment lease, the car financing, the social expectations of his dining habits, these are locked in.
Exactly. He has traded his financial resilience for a marginally softer steering wheel and a better view from his couch.
Wow. And I have to ask gently, is this just a modern problem? It sounds like a hyper-modern affliction. It feels intrinsically tied to Instagram-targeted ads, subscription models, modern corporate culture.
It really does feel that way.
But the drive to constantly expand our material baseline isn't just a byproduct of the internet, is it? It seems to tap into a vulnerability that predates modern capitalism entirely.
It absolutely does. The mechanisms of our consumption have modernized, but the underlying psychological fragility is centuries old. We can actually trace this exact phenomenon of expanding desire back to a French philosopher writing over 2.5 centuries ago.
Denis Diderot. We're going back to Paris in 1769.
Yes. Diderot was a brilliant Enlightenment thinker, the co-founder and chief editor of the Encyclopédie. But despite his immense intellectual influence, he lived the vast majority of his life in near absolute poverty.
Scraping by.
Exactly. But eventually, his circumstances changed dramatically. Catherine the Great of Russia, hearing of his financial struggles, essentially bought his personal library to serve as her own.
Wow.
And she paid him a massive sum up front and retained him as its librarian.
So suddenly, a man who has lived his entire adult life with nothing has a massive influx of sudden wealth.
And shortly after this windfall, Diderot acquired a new dressing gown.
A robe.
Yes, a luxurious, vibrant scarlet robe. And he was so struck by this experience that he wrote an essay titled "Regrets on Parting with My Old Dressing Gown."
That's a great title.
At first, he was elated with the garment. It was soft, it was warm, it was elegant. He sat in his study feeling like a man of status.
But then the contrast sets in, right?
The contrast is the catalyst. As he sat in his familiar study wearing this stunning scarlet robe, the environment around him suddenly felt offensive.
Offensive.
In his essay, he notes that his other possessions began to look tawdry. The new robe was completely incongruous with his old, threadbare life.
So the robe demands an environment that matches its elegance. It's almost like the object itself has agency, dictating what has to happen next.
That's exactly how it felt to him. So he begins a systemic purge of his old life.
Oh, no.
He looks at his old, comfortable straw chair and decides it's entirely unfit for a man wearing a scarlet gown. So he replaces it with an armchair upholstered in Moroccan leather. But once the leather chair is in the room, his old wooden desk looks shabby. So he buys a highly expensive new writing table.
It just keeps going.
Then the plain prints on his walls look cheap next to the writing table, so he purchases costly new artworks. Item by item, he replaces the entirety of his study to achieve aesthetic harmony with the robe.
And in doing so, he completely bankrupts himself.
Completely.
He spends the entirety of his windfall not on a grand estate, but on trying to make a room match a piece of clothing.
Yes.
I love the quiet realization he comes to at the end of the essay. He writes, "I was absolute master of my old dressing gown, but I have become a slave to my new one. Beware of the contamination of sudden wealth."
The contamination of sudden wealth. It captures the insidious nature of the phenomenon perfectly.
Because the poor man can sit in his worn chair without a second thought about appearances.
But the wealthy man is under a constant crushing strain to maintain a cohesive presentation of his wealth. This anecdote is so powerful that it actually gave birth to a formal anthropological concept. In 1986, the anthropologist Grant McCracken coined the term the Diderot effect.
And McCracken's framework revolves around this idea of Diderot unities.
Right. A Diderot unity is the concept that our consumer goods do not exist in isolation. They are clustered together in groups that are considered culturally and aesthetically complementary.
They fit together to project a highly specific social identity or role.
Exactly.
If I can try to map this onto a modern experience, it's the reason why if you buy a sleek, minimalist, mid-century modern dining table, you suddenly feel a profound, almost physical itch to throw away your mismatched coffee mugs.
Yes.
The mugs aren't broken, they still hold coffee.
They work perfectly fine.
But they violate the aesthetic unity of the dining room. A brightly colored plastic beanbag chair in that room wouldn't just look bad, it would feel like a cultural violation of the space you're trying to create.
That aesthetic ish is the core of the effect. Humans possess a deep, innate drive for harmony in our physical environments and in how we signal our social roles to others.
Right.
McCracken observed that when we acquire a deviant object, an item that belongs to a higher status or completely different Diderot unity, like the scarlet gown entering the shabby study, it shatters the existing harmony.
So the deviant item doesn't elevate the old items, it degrades them in our perception.
Precisely. It provokes a cascading spiral of consumption as we attempt to build an entirely new unity around the new baseline.
And we see the architecture of this everywhere once we know what to look for.
Yeah.
Like James Clear incorporates the Diderot effect into his behavioral work on habit stacking.
Oh, absolutely.
He points out how one action organically dictates the next. You buy a new houseplant, which forces you to realize your current pots are ugly,
Right.
which dictates a trip to the hardware store, which leads to buying specialized soil, which leads to buying a new watering can.
The single purchase of a fern generates 6 subsequent transactions.
Yeah. And sociologist Juliet Shore expands this into the realm of sustainability and macroeconomics, doesn't she?
She does. She discusses the upward creep of desire. A single upgraded purchase or even a well-intentioned gift from a friend creates a sudden, acute dissatisfaction with everything you already own.
And she points out the devastating environmental and social impacts of this.
Yes, because we are constantly discarding perfectly functional, durable goods simply because they no longer match the newly established aesthetic or status baseline of the deviant object. The consumption is driven entirely by internal psychological mismatch, not by functional necessity.
Now, I want to challenge this framing just slightly because viewing all aesthetic upgrades as a contamination feels a bit rigid to me.
Okay, sure.
Isn't there a genuine, deeply human joy in curating a life? If someone works hard for a decade and finally purchases a beautiful, handcrafted dining table, wanting chairs that respect the craftsmanship of that table isn't necessarily a descent into consumer slavery, is it?
No, of course not.
It's an appreciation for harmony. So where do we draw the line between a natural human appreciation for harmony and becoming the victim of a Diderot spiral?
That is a great question. The distinction lies entirely in the emotional driver behind the acquisition, the difference between intention and compulsion.
Intention versus compulsion.
Right. Curating an environment with intention involves saving for pieces that provide deep, lasting utility and genuine aesthetic pleasure. The pacing is slow, the purchases are planned,
Okay, that makes sense.
but a Diderot spiral is frantic. It is an anxiety-driven compulsion to replace functional items because of a sudden perceived inadequacy. The line is crossed the moment the pursuit of aesthetic unity begins to compromise your actual financial security.
Oh, I see.
If you are financing the Moroccan leather chair at 20% interest just so the scarlet robe makes sense in the room, you are no longer curating your life. You are servicing a psychological deficit.
That is a brilliant way to put it. The drive to make the chair match the table is incredibly potent. But the research suggests an even more powerful force at play. The drive to make our lives match our neighbors.
Yes. We don't just curate our homes in a vacuum. We are constantly, silently evaluating our baseline against the people around us.
So this transitions us from the internal physical environment to the external psychological environment.
Yeah.
We have to look at the social mirror and reference groups.
And the foundational framework here is Leon Festinger's social comparison theory from 1954.
Okay.
Festinger posited that humans have a relentless, innate drive to evaluate their own abilities, opinions, and social standing.
But because there isn't an objective yardstick for success, we have to invent one. I mean, I can't look at a dashboard in the sky to see if my life is going well. I have to look over the fence.
Exactly. The absence of an absolute metric forces us to rely entirely on relative metrics. We evaluate ourselves by comparing ourselves to a highly specific subset of people around us.
And in the context of wealth and lifestyle creep, the danger is that as our income rises, our reference group inevitably shifts upward with it.
That's the trap. When you get a promotion and move to a slightly more affluent neighborhood, or you transition to a higher tier firm, the baseline of what constitutes normal behavior radically changes.
The people I'm now comparing myself to are driving different cars, taking vacations to different continents, and sending their kids to different types of schools.
And suddenly your old baseline looks like Diderot's old study.
Right. And the neurological impact of this shift is profound, isn't it?
It really is. There is a fascinating study from Emory University that utilized fMRI imaging to map the brain's reward circuits in real time. They wanted to see how the brain processes financial gains.
And what did they find?
The findings were incredibly revealing. The brain's reward centers activate significantly more strongly in response to relative gains than they do to absolute gains.
Wait, let me make sure I'm fully grasping the implication of that. If my brain prioritizes relative gains, that means I would neurologically experience more joy making $100,000 a year if all my friends are making $80,000
Yes.
than I would making $150,000 a year if all my friends are making $200,000.
The fMRI scans back that up completely. The relative standing being ahead of the immediate pack triggers a much more intense release of dopamine than the absolute purchasing power of the money itself.
That explains so much about the anxiety of upward mobility. You work endlessly to get into the rich neighborhood, and the moment you move in, your brain recalibrates.
You're no longer the wealthiest person on your old block, you're the poorest person on your new block.
Right. Your absolute wealth increased, but your relative wealth plummeted, and your brain punishes you for it.
And that's why the consumption arms race is socially self-reinforcing. We are rarely buying luxury goods strictly for their functional utility. I mean, a $50,000 car gets you to the grocery store just as effectively as a $100,000 car.
Yeah, the premium is paid entirely for the social signaling.
Exactly. We purchase things to aggressively defend or advance our relative position within the hierarchy of our new reference group.
The materials outline a highly specific ecosystem where this plays out.
Yeah.
A junior attorney joining a prestigious white shoe corporate law firm. This seems like the perfect petri dish for this kind of social contagion.
It is an incredibly concentrated environment for social comparison. When a young attorney secures a position at a top-tier firm, they are handed a massive salary increase. But they are simultaneously immersed in a culture governed by intense, unspoken rules of consumption.
Right.
The partners and senior associates model a highly specific lifestyle. Flying business class, leasing apartments in very particular zip codes, wearing specific mechanical watches, dining at restaurants with a certain minimum price point per head.
And these are not viewed as extravagant luxuries within that bubble. They function as a required social uniform.
Precisely.
So what happens if you choose not to wear the uniform? What if the junior attorney decides to live like a graduate student, take the subway, and bank 80% of their salary?
The psychology of the environment makes that nearly impossible. Declining to participate in the established consumption patterns carries perceived reputational costs that feel intensely threatening.
Ah, I see.
If you show up to a client dinner wearing an ill-fitting suit or you decline a golf weekend because it's too expensive, you fear being categorized as an outsider. You fear projecting an image that you aren't successful enough to belong in that room.
So the spending isn't driven by joy. It's driven by a persistent, low-grade social anxiety. You spend to camouflage yourself within the wealth of the firm.
That's a great way to describe it.
It's almost like gravity. You don't feel it pulling on you as you walk, but it dictates how you move.
Yeah.
You think you're making an independent choice about a car, but your brain is actually doing a complex calculus of where you stand in the pack.
And the most dangerous aspect of that gravity is that it is relentless. Once you spend the money to match the pack inevitably moves. Someone else gets a larger bonus and shifts the baseline higher, and the cycle begins again.
So we upgrade the apartment, we lease the car, we buy the watch, we solve the Diderot unities, and we match our reference group perfectly. And for a fleeting moment, we feel a rush of satisfaction.
We feel like we've arrived.
But the profound question is, why does that feeling evaporate so predictably? Why is it psychologically impossible for us to just remain happy with the new, elevated baseline?
To answer that, we have to look at what is arguably the most robust, thoroughly proven finding in the entirety of behavioral psychology, the hedonic treadmill.
Also known as hedonic adaptation.
Right. The framework was established by Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell in their 1971 essay, Hedonic Relativism and Planning the Good Society.
And the core premise is that human beings possess an almost mechanical tendency to return to a relatively stable baseline level of happiness.
A personal set point, yes. And this return to the baseline occurs regardless of how massive the positive or negative life changes we experience are.
Hence the treadmill metaphor. You can increase the speed, you can increase the incline, you can run as hard as you possibly can, but you never actually change your location.
The treadmill ensures we remain in the exact same emotional place. And to truly grasp the gravity of this adaptation, we have to examine the landmark 1978 study by Brickman, Coates, and Janoff-Bollman.
This one is famous.
It remains one of the most cited studies in the history of psychology because of how radically it challenged our fundamental assumptions about human joy and suffering. They structured the study around 3 distinct groups of people.
And they didn't just look at people who got small raises. They went to the absolute extremes of human experience.
Exactly. They looked at people who had recently won major life-changing state lotteries. They looked at people who had recently suffered devastating accidents resulting in paraplegia or quadriplegia. And they maintained a control group of average individuals.
So they were measuring how these massive paradigm shifts altered long-term happiness.
Right.
Now, winning the lottery is the pinnacle of our cultural financial fantasy. We all imagine that a sudden influx of millions of dollars would permanently solve our existential dread.
And a paralyzing injury is a profound, almost unthinkable physical tragedy.
So the intuition is that the lottery winners would be floating on a cloud of euphoria forever, and the accident victims would be plunged into unrecoverable despair.
But the data utterly defied that intuition. The researchers found that after the initial expected spike of emotion, the overwhelming euphoria of the windfall, or the profound devastation of the accident, a powerful process of habituation took over.
Habituation?
Over time, the happiness levels of both the extreme groups began gravitating back toward their pre-event baseline averages.
I want to dig into the methodology of that, because it's genuinely hard to believe. How exactly were they measuring this? You can't just ask someone, "Are you happy?" and get a scientifically rigorous answer.
No, you can. They evaluated how much pleasure the subjects derived from highly specific, mundane, everyday activities, eating breakfast, talking with a friend, hearing a joke, reading a magazine.
Okay.
What they found was that the lottery winners actually derived less pleasure from these mundane events than the control group.
Wait, Less.
Yes, the massive spike of the lottery win had essentially blown out their dopamine receptors for ordinary joy.
Wow.
While the accident victims did report lower overall happiness than the control group, they were far above the bottom of the scale, and their capacity to derive pleasure from mundane events was almost identical to and sometimes higher than the lottery winner.
That is staggering. The lottery winners adapted to being millionaires so comprehensively that it ceased to be a source of active joy, and it actively diminished their ability to enjoy a good cup of coffee.
The human mind is an adaptation machine. We see this exact dynamic reflected in massive longitudinal data sets as well. The research highlights a major study out of the UK tracking 35,000 households over an entire decade.
Okay, so they weren't looking at lottery winners. They were looking at normal people experiencing positive income events, promotions, new jobs, significant raises.
Exactly.
And tracking someone over 10 years removes the noise of a short-term mood swing. So what did a decade of financial data reveal about their emotional state?
The timeline of dissipation is the most critical finding here. On average, 68% of the happiness boost generated by a positive income event entirely evaporated within 18
A
months.
year and a half. That's the lifespan of the joy.
But, and this is the terrifying intersection with our earlier discussion of the ratchet effect, while the joy faded in 18 months, the corresponding increase in spending remained permanent.
Oh, man.
The new car payment, the larger mortgage, the expensive habits, those persisted for the entire decade. The euphoria vanished, but the financial obligations were cemented.
Okay, let's look under the hood of this reset button. Why does the mind do this? The text outlines three specific, distinct processes of adaptation, categorized by researchers Shane Frederick and George Lowenstein. I want to walk through how each of these mechanics operates.
Frederick and Lowenstein recognize that hedonic adaptation isn't just one blunt force. It's a combination of three subtle psychological mechanisms. The first they identified is shifting adaptation levels. This is the most prevalent in our daily lives.
Okay, what does that look like?
When a stimulus in your life shifts, your perception of what constitutes neutral shifts alongside it.
So the raise hits, it feels incredible for 3 weeks, and then my brain simply recalibrates at 0 point. The higher salary isn't a bonus anymore. It's the new neutral baseline required just to feel normal.
Exactly.
It's like walking into a dimly lit room from the bright sunshine. At first, you can't see anything, you feel blind, but sit there for 10 minutes, your pupils dilate, and the darkness becomes your new visual baseline. You forget it's dark.
Precisely. You habituate to the size of the paycheck. You still maintain sensitivity to changes, meaning you'll still get a spike of joy if you get an unexpected $500 bonus on top of your new salary. But the elevated base salary itself provides zero active daily joy.
Okay, that's the first one. What's the second?
The second process is desensitization.
How does that differ from a shifting baseline?
Desensitization is a global decrease in sensitivity overall, which mutes your emotional reaction to extreme, ongoing situations. We often observe this in highly negative contexts.
Like what?
Individuals living in active, prolonged conflict zones eventually become desensitized to the daily reality of danger and destruction. They stop reacting with the profound, paralyzing shock that an outsider would experience hearing a siren.
So their baseline of emotional reactivity lowers dramatically as a psychological defense mechanism. They are protecting their nervous system from burning out.
Exactly right.
So shifting levels moves to 0 point, desensitization flattens the curve entirely. What's the third mechanism?
The third is sensitization. This is the inverse of desensitization. It involves an increase in hedonic response resulting from continuous exposure to a stimulus.
Okay, give me an example of that.
The classic example is a wine connoisseur. If you give a $20 bottle of wine and a $200 bottle of wine to someone who has never touched alcohol, they likely cannot tell the difference. They both just taste like fermented grape juice.
But the connoisseur has trained their palate.
Exactly. Through continuous, deliberate exposure, they have sensitized themselves to the incredibly subtle nuances of tannin, terroir, and vintage. Their capacity to extract pleasure from a truly spectacular bottle of wine is vastly higher than the novice.
That makes sense.
But there's a dark side to sensitization. As your capacity for high-end pleasure increases, your intolerance for lower-quality stimuli also increases. The connoisseur requires a much higher quality, much more expensive bottle of wine just to reach a baseline level of satisfaction. The $20 bottle is no longer neutral. It is actively offensive to their sensitized palate.
So if we map these three processes onto money, we shift our neutral point so the raise feels like nothing. We desensitize to the luxury we've acquired, so the nice car just feels like a metal box. And we sensitize our tastes so that we require increasingly finer, more expensive things just to avoid feeling deprived.
Yes.
It's like an utterly exhausting way to live.
It leads directly to a phenomenon that social theorist Greg Easterbrook termed abundance denial.
Abundance denial.
Easterbrook argues that human beings are remarkably, almost comically skilled at constructing elaborate, highly convincing internal narratives of deprivation, even when we are objectively surrounded by unprecedented abundance.
Because our aspirations have constantly shifted upward on the treadmill.
Right, so we genuinely deeply feel a sense of lack. We look at our massive closets and our full refrigerators and we feel poor, simply because our sensitized tastes demand more.
Let me pause and pose a question here, actually. We discussed how negative events, like the devastating accidents in the 1978 study, impact us. But the accident victims never fully return to the happiness levels of the control group.
That's true, they did.
So does the hedonic treadmill operate at the exact same speed in both directions? Do we adapt to tragedy as efficiently as we adapt to luxury?
The data strongly suggests we do not. The treadmill is asymmetrical. This introduces a fundamental psychological principle known as negativity bias.
Negativity bias.
From an evolutionary standpoint, human beings are hardwired to focus much more intensely on negative emotions, threats, and losses than on positive events.
Which makes perfect sense if you're a primate trying to survive, right?
Yeah.
A piece of ripe fruit is a positive event. It gives you calories. But a rustle in the bushes might be a predator. Ignoring the fruit won't kill you today, but ignoring the rustle absolutely will. So the brain prioritizes the rustle.
The brain treats negative stimuli as existential threats. Consequently, bad events hold significantly more psychological weight. They command more of our attention, and they are encoded much more deeply into our memory.
So adaptation to them is harder.
Because of this, our adaptation to negative events, chronic illness, poverty, the loss of a loved one, is vastly slower and far more difficult than our adaptation to positive events. We habituate to the new sports car in 3 weeks. We might never fully habituate to chronic back pain.
So the treadmill is tilted against us. We sprint to keep up with joy, but we drag ourselves through misery.
Yes.
It makes you wonder if there's any escape. And the text actually ventures into some truly wild philosophical territory here regarding the absolute limits of the treadmill. It brings up transhumanism.
It does.
How on earth does transhumanist philosophy connect to my monthly budget?
It connects at the deepest biological level. Transhumanist philosophers, specifically figures like David Pearce and Mark Allen Walker, look at the hedonic treadmill and conclude that it is not a psychological software glitch, it is a fundamental hardware problem.
Meaning?
It is biologically hardwired into our neurochemistry. Therefore, they argue, the only way to ever truly step off the treadmill is to radically alter our biology.
They are literally advocating for biohacking human happiness.
Yes. Walker introduced the concept of biohappiness. The premise is that instead of trying to manipulate our external environment, earning more money, buying nicer houses, chasing status, we should focus on directly manipulating the biological roots of happiness to permanently elevate our set point.
I'm Pierce.
Pearce goes even further, arguing that the biological capacity for suffering could eventually be entirely eradicated through genetic recalibration. He envisions promoting hyperthymic genes that foster a persistent, indestructible state of well-being without losing our responsiveness to the world.
That sounds like a sci-fi dystopia where everyone is just chemically lobotomized into smiling all the time.
It raises massive, practically unsolvable ethical and evolutionary questions. Some even discuss the theoretical extreme of wire-heading direct, continuous electrical stimulation of the brain's pleasure centers to provide uniform, uninterrupted bliss.
But if you can just press a button and feel the exact euphoria of winning the lottery, why would you ever go to work? Why would you build a society?
The motivation to do literally anything would evaporate.
Exactly.
But bringing it back from the science fiction edge, the underlying transhumanist argument serves as a profound critique of our relationship with money. Their point is that as long as we are operating with our current biological hardware, money alone will never permanently solve the problem of human dissatisfaction.
The treadmill is built into the machine.
We are trying to solve a neurochemical deficit with paper currency, and it simply does not work.
It highlights the absolute futility of trying to consume our way to permanent joy.
It really does.
So if this treadmill is constantly resetting the baseline inside every single individual human mind, what happens when we zoom out?
Yeah.
Let's leave the realm of individual psychology and look at entire societies over the span of decades. Does more money make a nation happier? If a country steadily grows its GDP, builds better infrastructure, and increases the average wealth of its citizens over 50 years, does the nation as a whole get happier?
That specific question burst an entire subfield of macroeconomic study. It brings us to the macro view of money and happiness, centered around the Easterlin paradox.
Named for the economist Richard Easterlin, who published a massive paper in 1974.
Yes, the paper was titled, Does Economic Growth Improve the Human Lot? And at the time Easterlin published this, the dominant, almost unquestioned paradigm in economics was the Pigouvian presumption.
The Pigouvian presumption.
This was the assumption that changes in economic welfare were a perfect one-to-one proxy for changes in social welfare.
So if the gross domestic product goes up, the national happiness must go up. It was treated as a mathematical certainty.
Exactly. But Easterlin decided to bypass the assumption and actually test the empirical long-term data. And what he uncovered completely fractured the economic consensus. He found a paradox.
To understand the friction in his findings, we really have to meticulously break down the three distinct, seemingly contradictory statements that form the Easterlin paradox. Let's take them one by one. What is statement one?
Statement one operates at the micro level. Within a given country, at a specific snapshot in time, richer people are demonstrably happier than poorer people.
Which aligns with our basic intuition. If you look at Chicago today, the executive making $300,000 a year is generally reporting a higher level of happiness than the hourly worker making $30,000 a year. The money provides security, health care, and options.
Exactly. Statement two moves to the macro level. Between different countries, at a given snapshot in time, richer nations are happier than poorer nations.
Again, completely logical. A highly developed nation with massive wealth, paved roads, clean water, and stable institutions is going to report higher average happiness than a nation struggling with deep poverty and instability.
Both of those statements reaffirm the power of money. But statement three is where the paradox emerges. Easterlin found that over the long term, looking at decades of time series data, a country's economic growth trends are not significantly related to its happiness growth trends.
Like, not related.
Meaning, as a specific nation's GDP grows massively over 30 or 40 years, the average happiness of its citizens remains essentially flat. It does not rise along with the wealth.
So, rich people are happier than poor people. Rich countries are happier than poor countries. But a country getting richer over time doesn't make it happier over time.
That's the paradox.
It feels like an impossible riddle. If I take a poor country and make it rich, it should jump to the rich country happiness level, shouldn't it?
That is the exact tension that has sparked 50 years of fierce methodological warfare among economists. To understand how this riddle is solved, we have to interrogate how we are actually measuring the word happiness. The research relies heavily on a crucial distinction between two fundamentally different types of well-being: evaluative well-being and emotional or experienced well-being.
Let me see if I can deduce the difference here. Evaluative well-being sounds like a macro judgment. It's me sitting on a porch at 80 years old, looking back at my career, my savings, and my family, and calculating if I had a successful life.
Yes, that's it.
And emotional well-being sounds like the micro. It's whether I got stuck in terrible traffic this morning, spilled coffee on my shirt, and feel currently stressed out.
That is the fundamental divide perfectly articulated. Evaluative well-being is cognitive. It is your overarching assessment of your life's trajectory.
And how do they measure that?
Methodologically, it is often measured using an instrument called the Cantril ladder. Surveyors ask subjects to imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top represents the best possible life you can imagine for yourself, and the bottom represents the worst possible life. You are asked, on which step do you feel you stand at this time? It's a highly analytical judgment of status.
And emotional well-being is entirely different.
Emotional well-being bypasses the analysis. It measures your day-to-day effect. It asks about the actual frequency and intensity of your joy, stress, sadness, anxiety, and anger in the preceding 24 hours. It is not how you judge your life, it is how you actually feel while you are living it.
So when Easterlin says long-term GDP growth doesn't increase happiness, which of these two metrics is he looking at?
The paradox is largely rooted in evaluative well-being. Over decades, life satisfaction seems to decouple from GDP growth. But what about the day-to-day effect? Does more money make your Tuesday morning less stressful?
Right.
This specific question triggered one of the most famous, highly publicized debates in modern economics, the plateau debate.
I remember this dominating the news cycle.
In 2010, behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman and economist Angus Deaton published a massive study. They analyzed data from hundreds of thousands of Americans and concluded that day-to-day emotional well-being plateaus at an income of roughly $75,000 a year.
That number became a cultural touchstone. Money doesn't buy happiness after 75 grand. People used it to justify taking lower-paying jobs, to argue against corporate greed, to frame their entire financial worldview.
It was a deeply comforting statistic for many. Kahneman and Deaton found that while the Cantrell ladder, the evaluative life satisfaction, kept rising indefinitely with income, your actual daily positive emotions maxed out once your basic needs, stability, and moderate comforts were secured.
So beyond 75,000, the extra money didn't make you laugh more or feel less daily stress.
Right. But a decade later, the methodology of measuring emotion evolved.
Enter Matthew Killingsworth.
Yes, in 2021, Killingsworth published a direct challenge to the plateau. He used a significantly more advanced methodology. Instead of asking people to remember how they felt yesterday, which introduces massive memory bias, he used smartphone apps to randomly ping tens of thousands of people throughout the day, asking them to report their exact emotional state in that specific moment.
Oh, that's brilliant. It removes the narrative we tell ourselves about our emotions and just captures the raw data of the moment.
And his raw data contradicted the 2010 consensus. Killingsworth found absolutely no plateau. He found that emotional well-being continued to rise linearly with the log of income, well past $75,000, pushing past $200,000 and beyond.
Wow.
According to his data, more money continuously bought more daily joy.
So we have two titans of behavioral economics with massive data sets completely contradicting each other. Does daily joy hit a ceiling or doesn't it?
What happened next is a phenomenal example of scientific integrity. Instead of retreating to their corners and writing attacking papers, Kahneman and Killingsworth actually teamed up.
They did.
In 2023, they engaged in an adversarial collaboration to jointly reanalyze all the data and resolve the conflict. And what they discovered was a profound hidden nuance that both of them had initially missed.
Which was?
The plateau does exist, but it only exists for a very specific subset of the population, the least happy 20% of people.
That completely reframes the conversation. Let me parse that out. If I am someone in that bottom 20%, meaning I am dealing with profound structural unhappiness, maybe I am suffering from clinical depression, or I'm in the middle of a brutal divorce, or I'm grieving the loss of a child.
Yes.
If I am in poverty, money helps immensely, up to a certain point, maybe around $100,000 adjusted for inflation, because it removes the compounding stress of financial terror.
Right.
But beyond that point, giving a clinically depressed, grieving person $1 million won't suddenly make them experience daily joy. The money cannot fix the underlying source of the misery.
That is the exact mechanism. The profound miseries that anchor the bottom 20% cannot be paved over with excess capital. The plateau is real for them because their emotional capacity is capped by other forces.
But for everyone else,
For everyone else, the other 80% of the population who are moderately or very happy, more money does equal more day-to-day positive emotion with no observable plateau. For the majority, more money continually enhances daily life.
so the cultural narrative was wrong. Money absolutely mattered.
It undeniably matters. The Easterlin paradox does not mean that wealth is irrelevant. It simply highlights the complex, nonlinear relationship between a point-in-time snapshot of wealth and the long-term intergenerational trajectory of a society.
Now, I want to be extremely careful here, because whenever we discuss macroeconomic data showing that long-term GDP growth doesn't guarantee a parallel rise in national happiness, it inevitably gets weaponized politically.
It does.
There are movements like the degrowth movement that use the Easterlin paradox to argue that since continuous economic growth doesn't permanently elevate the national mood, we should intentionally shrink our economies, reduce consumption, and focus on other metrics beyond GDP. As the host, I just have to play devil's advocate here. Isn't that a massive leap in logic? Just because growth doesn't maximize happiness doesn't mean shrinking the economy won't cause immense suffering.
It is a significant leap, and the source material is highly disciplined in maintaining absolute neutrality on this. The text explicitly notes that while the Easterlin paradox is frequently cited by political and economic groups arguing for degrowth or anti-capitalist frameworks, the paradox itself does not causally justify or endorse economic decline.
The data just shows a flat line, not a prescription.
Exactly. The empirical data simply demonstrates a lack of long-term positive correlation between GDP growth and happiness growth. It absolutely does not prove that intentionally engineering an economic contraction would increase or even maintain current happiness levels. We are analyzing the behavioral economics of the data, not endorsing a political doctrine or a policy prescription.
Understood. So returning to the behavioral reality. If short-term economic booms make people demonstrably happier, but long-term sustained growth doesn't seem to permanently elevate the national baseline, what's missing? Is it possible that we aren't actually reacting to the absolute amount of wealth we possess, but rather we are reacting violently to the changes in our wealth?
That intuition unlocks the final piece of the macroeconomic puzzle. It brings us to one of the most powerful, unseen forces in human psychology, the asymmetry of how we process financial gains versus financial losses.
Prospect theory.
Yes, developed again by Kahneman and Tversky, they demonstrated the concept of loss aversion, or happiness asymmetry. Psychologically, human beings are not rational calculators. We are incredibly disproportionately sensitive to loss.
Okay, how disproportionate?
The research shows that we are more than twice as sensitive to economic downturns and financial losses as we are to equivalent economic upswings and gains.
So the pain of losing a $100 bill out of my wallet is twice as sharp and lasts twice as long as the brief joy of finding a $100 bill on the sidewalk.
The emotional weight is completely lopsided. Now, scale that asymmetry up to the macro level to explain the Easterlin paradox. Think about a country's economy over a 50-year timeline. The overall trajectory of the GDP is upward. But it doesn't move in a straight line. It moves through the business cycle.
It goes through periods of massive expansion, and then it suffers recessions, booms, and busts.
Exactly.
How does loss aversion interact with that cycle?
During a prolonged boom, people's incomes rise. They experience a short-term increase in happiness. But because of the hedonic treadmill we discussed, they rapidly habituate to that new higher income. The joy fades, the baseline resets. Then a sharp recession hits. The market crashes. Incomes drop, unemployment spikes, portfolios are slashed.
And because of the asymmetry, that loss hits them twice as hard.
It is emotionally catastrophic. Because we are twice as sensitive to loss, the psychological damage inflicted by a 2-year recession entirely wipes out the emotional gains generated by the preceding 10-year boom.
That perfectly explains the flat line of the paradox. A country might be vastly wealthier in 2026 than it was in 1976, but because the population had to suffer through 3 or 4 brutal recessions along the way, the collective national psyche is heavily scarred by the trauma of the losses.
Keeping the average historical happiness completely flat despite the absolute growth in wealth, it is a highly compelling theoretical model, and it is backed up by a very specific subset of data. The researchers looked at expansion-only countries.
What defines an expansion-only country?
These are nations that, due to highly unique historical, political, or resource-driven circumstances, experience continuous economic growth over a long period of time without suffering any significant busts or recessions. They avoided the business cycle downturns.
If the asymmetry theory holds, their happiness shouldn't be flat.
And it wasn't. In those expansion-only countries, the happiness metrics actually grew alongside the GDP.
Amazing.
Because they didn't experience the disproportionate scarring psychological damage of recessions to drag the historical average down, the continuous gains actually resulted in a steadily happier populace. It strongly suggests that our long-term relationship with money at a societal level is dictated heavily by the trauma of losing it rather than the joy of having it.
Let's bring this massive macro concept back down to the individual level. Back to our worker, Alex. With his $18,000 raise, he upgraded his life. He leased the car, got the apartment. How does loss aversion trap him personally? The outline refers to this dynamic as the golden handcuffs.
The golden handcuffs effect is the ultimate paralyzing manifestation of loss aversion in personal finance. Alex has built an elevated lifestyle. Because of the hedonic treadmill, he adapted to the luxury of the apartment and the car in a few months. They no longer provide him with any active joy, they are just his neutral baseline.
Right.
But if he tries to give them up, If he decides he wants to save more money, so he tries to downgrade to a smaller apartment or sell the car, he will instantly trigger that massive asymmetry of loss.
Even though the car wasn't making him happy, losing the car will make him deeply miserable.
He will experience acute, disproportionate psychological pain and a profound feeling of deprivation. He has unwittingly created a structural dependency on a high income just to sustain a baseline that he doesn't even enjoy anymore.
So he might despise his job, he might be working 80 hours a week, but he is trapped.
He cannot leave because the pain of voluntarily downgrading his lifestyle is neurologically intolerable.
It's a phenomenon known in psychology as the escalation of commitment, isn't it? We fiercely rationalize keeping expensive habits. The private schools, the country club memberships, the luxury leases, long after they cease to serve us.
Because we've invested so much of our identity and capital into maintaining the Diderot unity of our lives that we refuse to cut our losses.
Voluntarily stepping backward feels like a public failure, a devastating loss of status.
We become prisoners of our own previous upgrades.
It's like climbing a ladder where the rungs dissolve into dust the moment you step up. You can't climb down, the rungs are gone, you can only fall. So you have to keep desperately reaching for the next rung, expending more and more energy, just hoping you don't exhaust yourself and plummet.
That is a stark, highly accurate visualization of the trap.
So, if the entire system is rigged against us by our own neurochemistry, if the hedonic treadmill constantly resets our joy to zero, if our social mirror constantly forces us into an unwinnable consumption arms race, and if loss aversion makes the ladder constantly disappear behind us, how on earth do some people manage to feel financially at peace?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Because we all know people who make relatively modest incomes, but exude a profound sense of calm, while others earning seven figures are vibrating with stress. What is the mechanical difference in their minds?
The difference is found in what the research calls the inner ledger. It is the critical gap between objective wealth and subjective wealth.
Objective versus subjective.
Yes. To understand this mechanism, we look at a brilliant study conducted by researcher Agata Gasiorowska. She investigated the precise relationship between what you actually possess, your objective wealth, meaning your verifiable income, assets, and net worth, and how you feel about your financial situation, which is your subjective wealth.
Given everything we've discussed, I'm going to deduce that those two numbers are not perfectly correlated.
They are shockingly misaligned. Gasiorowska's study found only a very modest correlation between actual objective income and perceived subjective financial satisfaction. Earning more money only slightly predicted whether a person actually felt better about their finances.
The massive gap between the reality of the bank account and the feeling in the chest is explained by our deep-seated, often entirely unconscious psychological attitudes toward money.
Exactly.
She identified two specific variables that dictate this gap, right? Money anxiety and financial control. Let's look at money anxiety first. In statistical terms, this acts as a mediator. How does that filter work?
Well, a mediator variable explains how or why a specific relationship occurs. Money anxiety represents a state of persistent hesitation, profound distrust, and negative emotionality tied to financial matters.
It's the physical pit in your stomach when you have to open a bill, completely, regardless of whether you have the funds to pay it.
Yes. The study found that higher objective wealth does directly reduce money anxiety. Having a massive cash buffer does alleviate some baseline survival worry. And that reduced money anxiety, in turn, allows for an increase in subjective wealth.
But what happens if someone's baseline personality is just highly anxious about money? What if they grew up in extreme poverty and the fear never left them?
Then the correlation breaks down completely. Highly anxious individuals, and Gasiorowska's research strongly ties this specific anxiety to lower self-esteem and high materialistic tendencies, suffer from a constant gnawing discrepancy between what they currently have and what they desire.
So they could objectively earn $1 million a year, but their money anxiety acts as a permanent distorting filter.
It warped their perceptions so severely that they always feel precarious. They will never, ever feel subjectively wealthy because the anxiety prevents the objective reality from registering.
That is the dark side of the ledger. But what about the other variable? Financial control. The research classifies this as a moderator.
Yes, a moderator is a variable that changes the strength or direction of the relationship between two other variables. Financial control represents the administrative behavioral side of personal finance. It is thriftiness, carefulness, meticulous budgeting, and long-term planning.
So does being a spreadsheet nerd, tracking every single penny, automatically make you feel subjectively richer?
Not automatically. Having high financial control doesn't magically grant you a feeling of immense wealth. Rather, it serves a critical stabilizing function. It makes your subjective feeling accurately match your objective reality.
Let me test an analogy here. If objective wealth is the actual physical terrain you're driving a car over, financial control is the car's suspension system.
Oh, I like that.
A highly tuned suspension system doesn't pave the road. It doesn't change the objective reality of the potholes or the gravel. But it ensures that the subjective experience inside the cabin, the feeling of the ride, matches what the vehicle can safely handle. If you have no financial control, your suspension is broken. Even if you're driving on a perfectly smooth, high-income highway, the cabin is violently shaking, and you feel completely out of control.
That is an excellent mechanical mapping of the psychology. If you have low financial control, meaning you don't budget, you ignore your credit card statements, you spend impulsively based on mood, your perception of your wealth becomes entirely detached from reality.
You might objectively make $150,000, but you feel constantly terrifyingly broke because the money just seems to vanish into the ether.
Or even more dangerously, you might make $50,000 but feel subjectively wealthy because you are willfully ignoring the mounting high-interest debt that is funding your lifestyle.
Ignorance is bliss right up until the repo man tows the car away.
Exactly. But individuals with high financial control constantly, relentlessly monitor their resources. Because they plan, they automatically and dynamically adjust their lifestyle standards to match their actual verified resources.
They do not accidentally succumb to lifestyle creep because every single dollar of a raise is tracked and allocated before it can be unconsciously absorbed by the Diderot effect.
Precisely. So if they earn a modest income, they live a modest life comfortably and feel at peace. If they earn a high income, they allocate it intentionally and feel at peace. The control creates transparency.
Financial control isn't about hoarding pennies or punishing yourself with austerity. It is entirely about clarity.
Clarity is the mechanism that generates peace of mind. Planners create an internal psychological environment where their subjective feeling is firmly anchored to mathematical truth, rather than being dragged around by social comparison, present bias, or hedonic impulses.
As we start to bring this deep dive into the human mind to a close, I want to gently bring our focus back to where we started. We began with that quiet exhale, the momentary relief of receiving a little more money.
We did.
And over the last hour, we've systematically broken down exactly how and why that relief gets hijacked. We've explored how money silently shifts our neutral baselines, how we invite the cascading Diderot effect into our living rooms, how we allow our social mirrors to dictate our spending, and how the brutal asymmetry of loss traps us in golden handcuffs.
When we lay out the totality of the psychological traps, the biases, the treadmills, the anxieties, it can sound overwhelmingly pessimistic. It can feel as though we are simply doomed to be dissatisfied.
But the research provides a very calm, highly actionable resolution. The antidote to the hedonic treadmill isn't draconian austerity. It isn't retreating to a cabin in the woods and refusing to ever buy a nice cup of coffee again.
No, not at all. The antidote is intention. And there is a specific mechanical framework suggested in the materials to build that intention, the one-third rule of pre-allocation.
It is a brilliantly simple mechanism designed to short-circuit present bias. The rule dictates that when you receive a raise or a windfall, you do not let the entirety of the money hit your checking account, where your mental accounting can label it all as a reward. You pre-allocate it before you ever see it.
You divide the net increase into strict thirds.
Walk me through the thirds.
One-third goes automatically, instantly into long-term savings or investments. It builds your absolute wealth.
Okay.
One-third is explicitly allowed for deliberate, intentional lifestyle upgrades. You are a human being. You get to enjoy the tangible fruit of your labor without guilt.
And the final third.
The final third is dedicated entirely to debt reduction or building a liquid safety reserve.
It provides rigid structure, but it doesn't eliminate the joy of earning more. It just slows the ratchet down.
It forces you to make a conscious executive function choice rather than surrendering to an impulsive biological default. Because the ultimate argument of all these behavioral studies is that true wealth requires a fundamental personal redefinition of success.
We have been heavily conditioned by our culture to view success purely as status and the unchecked ability to consume.
But the psychology shows that true sustainable wealth is independence, stability, and the total peace of mind that comes from clarity.
I want to end on a concept that completely changed how I view this entire topic. It's Daniel Kahneman's idea of the U index.
Ah, the U index, or unpleasant index. It's a brilliant inversion of how we usually think about happiness.
How so?
It is a metric Kahneman proposed that measures the proportion of time a person spends in an actively unpleasant emotional state, feeling stressed, angry, sad, or anxious.
Instead of trying to measure how much intense euphoric joy money can buy us, which we know from the hedonic treadmill is fleeting and subject to rapid adaptation, Kahneman suggests a completely different objective.
What if the goal of money isn't to buy maximum joy?
What if the goal of money is simply to minimize the amount of time we spend feeling miserable?
It shifts the entire paradigm. If you use your income to build a buffer against disaster, if you use it to buy back your time from a job you hate, if you use it to permanently alleviate the crushing stress of debt, you are directly lowering your U index.
You are spending significantly less of your daily life in a state of unpleasant anxiety.
And neurologically speaking, minimizing misery is a much more achievable, sustainable, and permanent form of well-being than constantly chasing the evaporating high of a new luxury car.
Using money as a shield against misery rather than an engine for temporary euphoria,
Right.
that changes the math on every financial decision you make.
It really does.
We spend so much of our lives desperately trying to acquire the next new dressing gown, the next shiny thing, hoping it will finally make us feel complete, that it will finally quiet the anxiety of the social mirror. But after looking at the depth of the psychology, the treadmills we run on, and the invisible gravity that pulls at our wallets, I want to leave you with this question to ponder on your own. What if the ultimate luxury isn't found in what you can afford to buy, but in the things you can finally afford to look at, understand, and comfortably walk away from?